Thank you for joining me for this study of Isaiah from the Lifeway material. It's session 8. The title is God Renews, and the lesson summary statement is God provides strength for those who trust in Him. There are two pieces of paper I'm going to have on the class members' chairs when they arrive for Sunday school. One is a copy of an article from the Gospel Coalition. It's by Kevin D. Young. And the title is Why Idolatry Was and Is Attractive. And I'll use that in the first lesson. And then a blank piece of paper that I'm going to use in terms of our conclusion. On the board, I will have written the lesson summary statement, God provides strength for those who trust in Him. And then I'm going to have a series of comparisons, and I'm going to ask them as they arrive if they would just simply go up and vote by putting a mark, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a slash mark, and just see who gets the most votes. These are the categories that I have: Elvis versus the Beatles, Sean Connery versus Daniel Craig, spring versus the fall, football versus basketball, Washington versus Lincoln. And just to have some fun in terms of comparisons. These comparisons may be up for debate, but Isaiah says there is no debate when it comes to comparing anything or anyone to God. And Isaiah reveals God is beyond comparison. He's the only one true God. He's the creator and sustainer of everything. And he's going to show that in this passage in Isaiah. Now let me just set the context. We've just completed the first section of Isaiah, chapters 1 to 39, and we've been over the outline of that. I just simply want to bring them back to the last few chapters, chapters 36 to 39. And again, let me just mention, I found a great deal of help on this outline and context from Dr. John Oswalt in his book, his commentary, as well as on the YouTube videos that are provided. But chapters 36 to 39 is Can God Be Trusted? And you have the story of Hezekiah. Hezekiah is faced with the invasion of the Assyrian army, and in chapter 37 he trusts God, and God deals with the Assyrians and kills an army, really 185,000 men in one night, and the Assyrians pack up and go home. In chapter 38, Hezekiah becomes ill. Isaiah delivers the message he's going to die, and Hezekiah prays, and God heals him and gives him 15 more years. And then in chapter 39, Babylonian emissaries show up to wish Hezekiah the best for his health and find him recovered. And instead of him giving glory to God, he takes the glory to himself. And it's answering that question, is Hezekiah the one we've been expecting? And the answer is no. Now, Isaiah in chapter 40 through 66, he's talking to the people of God that are going to be in the future 150 years. And this has created some problems with some scholars. They just simply can't believe that Isaiah can foresee what's going to happen and speak to people 150 years in the future. Their problem is they're having a problem with the supernatural element of the scriptures. And if you can believe Genesis 1:1, you can believe that God can give a prophet a message for people that are going to live 150 years in the future. There are some interesting things about between Isaiah chapter 39 and chapter 40 to 66. In Isaiah chapter 1, verse 30 through chapter 39, there's lots of historical details, the names of kings, the names of places, lots of details, descriptions of Jerusalem. When you come to chapter 40 through 66, a lot of those historical details fall by the wayside, and what you have are Isaiah's message directed to these people. And his messages are words of hope and encouragement. Because what's going to happen 150 years in the future is the Babylonians will return, and this time they're going to defeat and capture Judah. and they're going to transport people back to their own land. And so Isaiah is giving them messages of hope and messages of comfort. And then you come to this passage, chapter 40. Chapter 40 is an introduction to what's going to be coming in the rest of it. And it starts off with the words comfort. Comfort my people. A better translation is the word encourage, for he's wanting to put strength into the people. He's wanting to put steel into their backbones for the things that they're about to face. And so what happens in our Sunday school lesson, the text that we're looking at, is verse 18 to 31 serves as a conclusion to what he's been saying in verses 1 through 17. It seems as though the people are asking three questions at this time. You can imagine they're under captivity. Their nation is being destroyed. The people are being taken away from the promised land. And it seems as though they're asking three questions that are being answered in this chapter. The first question is, does God want to deliver us? That's being answered in verses 1 through 11. And he said, I want you to be comforted. I want you to be encouraged. And it ends with God picturing himself as their shepherd. The second question, can God deliver us? And you have these magnificent pictures of the power of God and the wisdom of God. And then the third question is he going to deliver us? And the answer that he gives is yes, he's going to give you the strength and he's going to deliver you. Now the points of our lesson begin with the living God. In chapter 40, verse 18 to 20. An idol is no comparison to God. They're nothing more than human creations without the power to even stand on their own. That's the summary statement for Isaiah 40, verse 18 to 20. The questions arise from the description of God's greatness in the previous verses. You'll notice he says in verse 18, with whom will you compare God? What likeness will you set up for comparison with him? An idol? Something that a smelter casts and a metalworker plates with gold and makes silver chains for? A poor person contributes wood for a pedestal that will not rot. He looks for a skilled craftsman to set up an idol that will not fall over. That is a response to the greatness that he's been talking about in the previous question. Now, idolatry is a huge issue in the Bible. Oftentimes, the kings of the Old Testament were evaluated solely on their response to idolatry. They may have been a king with a great economy, or they had a strong military and the nation was secure. But if they didn't deal with this issue of idolatry, then God doesn't evaluate them in very high marks. Often, the prophets would mock idolatry as a way to show God's people how foolish it was to worship an idol. And Isaiah is doing that here. He's just incredulous. You have a living God. So when you look at these verses, what is it that Isaiah is saying about the idols? What is it that he says about the idols that mocks them and points out how foolish they are? The thing I'm looking for as the class responds is it's things like, well, idols are man-made. Idols are inanimate. They're not living, and they're useless. It seems to be the things that Isaiah is wanting to tell us about these idols. Now, idolatry puzzles us when we read this, when we read about idolatry in the Bible. But there must have been something very attractive about idolatry, because the people of God in the Old Testament are always being drawn towards it. And so if it was attractive to them, there must be something about it that's also attractive to us, though it may look differently for us. And so then I want to have them look at this article, Why Idolatry Was and Is Attractive. It's written by Kevin D. Young. I found it at the Gospel Coalition. And he goes through and he gives 9 points for why idolatry was attractive to the people of that day. And I simply want them, I gave it to them at the first of the class because I was hoping that they would be glancing over it as we begin to move towards starting the class and taking prayers. But I want them to glance over it, and I'm asking them, which of these 9 do you think is the most appealing to people today? And then after we've had some discussion about that, which of these 9 creates the most question for you as to why it would be appealing? And hopefully we can have some discussion about that. And I have a last question for this. What is it that is the common theme that tie all 9 of these together? Now, the attractiveness of idolatry is the fact that you can control an idol. So much of the pagan religion was about bargaining with the god and giving him what he wants so that you can get what you want. They had no concept of coming before their God just simply out of reverence and worship and love and gratitude for their God. Their relationship with God was one of a bargain. And so they attempted to manipulate their God. Now, just some things about this passage that I'd point out in this. He shows the process that the human beings go through in making this idol. And part of that is just to show, do you see how ridiculous this is? Here is a man who is making his God. And not only that, the wealth of the person determines the value of the God himself. Here's a poor man. What can a poor man provide? He can just provide a chunk of wood that may provide the base on which they can set this idol upon. And so it's showing the foolishness of this idolatry. And you'll notice in verse 19 it has that question. An idol? It's almost like it's an incredulous statement that somebody would do these kinds of things. The second point is sovereign creator. In verse 21, he asks them to give careful thought about the origins of the universe and the fact that it must point to a creator. Notice in verse 21, do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not considered the foundations of the earth? And he's simply saying, you have information about creation, and it testifies to the real creator. If you were having a conversation with someone who didn't believe in the world being created, what are some of the arguments? What are some of the things you'd point to as evidence that this is a created world? This is not the result of an accident. It's not chaos that was organizing itself. So what are your arguments that you would use? This is what he's referring to here. You have known these kinds of things. And ask your class to share with you, what are the things that are strong testimonies that this world has a creator? You'll also notice that in this title of the lesson, this point, it says sovereign creator. If he made the universe, there is nothing that can thwart his plans. And this would be a great encouragement to a defeated people like Judah. It would also be a great encouragement to defeated people today. This God is in control. It may seem like he's not in control, and you may be confused about the way that he's doing things, but he's sovereign. He's the boss. He is the one in charge of what's happening in this world. Verse 22, these verses stress God's transcendence, verse 22 to 24. Now, the idea of transcendence is that God is great and high above us. He is very, very different from us. How does this encourage Judah? See what he says in verse 22? God is enthroned above the circle of the earth. That's talking about where his throne is, where he rules. Its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. It's stressing the smallness of human beings. It's emphasizing the greatness of God. He stretches out the heavens like thin cloth and spreads them out like a tent to live under. This God is so great. He is so transcendent that he uses the universe like a tent. And we've yet to see the end of the universe. He reduces princesses to nothing. Princesses were people who were placed in positions of ruling. Well, they're of no concern to him. And makes judges of the earth like a wasteland. These are the people who have the power to make decisions about people's lives, but God can just move them off the scene. And notice the temporalness of these people. They are barely planted, barely sown. Their stem hardly takes root in the ground when he blows on them and they wither, and a whirlwind carries them away like stubble. It's the picture of such great people. These are the most powerful people, and yet they hardly get started in life when God just simply puffs on them and they're taken away. It is a powerful picture of the transcendence of God. How would that be a source of encouragement to people like Judah who are experiencing the hard parts of life? Now, transcendence, you might conclude that God is removed from us and he doesn't notice us. But that's not the way the Bible pictures this concept of the greatness and exaltedness and otherness of God. The Bible pictures and uses the idea of transcendence that he is so great that he notices everything. This is the stress of transcendence in the Bible. And so he would be saying, this is a God that knows what's happening, and he's certainly in a position of power to do something about it. You see that followed up in verse 25. To whom will you compare me, or who is my equal? Asks the Holy One. Look up and see who created these. He brings out the stars by number. He calls all of them by name. Because of his great power and strength, not one of them is missing. It's really a strong comparison with idolatry. Looking up would be pictures of those who might look up to the stars to worship them. And the pagans would give the stars names that would represent God. For example, the morning star is called Venus, and that was one of the pagans' gods across several cultures. And he's saying that God numbers them. They just name some of the stars, but God names all of them. He numbers all of them, and he knows if there's any that are missing. That's how great he is in his power. It also stresses the holiness of God. When it says, asks the Holy One, in the original language, the article the is not there. And so it's almost saying it as if it's God's name, asks Holy One. And so this God is not only transcendent and powerful and sovereign and creator, there's something else about him that puts him beyond any other God, and that is he is holy. He is not just separate, but he's morally perfect. He is simply untouchable when it comes to that kind of thing. So here's Judah experiencing horrible destruction. So how does this truth, that he is the sovereign creator, how does that truth strengthen them? For you remember, that's how he starts the chapter off. This is what he was wanting to do, is to encourage them. How does this truth encourage God's people during times of difficulty? And people have experienced times of difficulty in this season of the pandemic, haven't they? So where do you find strength in these teachings? Now here's some things that I hope to stress to the class and bring out in the class. The fact that he's sovereign creator means that God's in charge of every circumstance of my life. It didn't come into my life and surprise him. He knew it was coming. And in every circumstance of my life, he's in charge. He's the master of it. It's not more powerful than him. It's not more lasting than him. He is the sovereign creator. Being the sovereign creator, it means that nothing can stop him accomplishing his purposes in this world, and in particular in my life. He's in charge. He's got the power. Nothing stops his purposes in me or in this world. And the fact that he's the sovereign creator and he's transcendent means he wants to meet with me. These are things that would encourage God's people. The last point, God provides strength for those who trust in him, is tireless source. Isaiah 40, verse 27 through 31. And he's saying to the people, God is able to provide strength to those who put their hope and their faith and trust in God. Now, verse 27 states the problem. And what's stated here is the question that everyone who suffers asks of God. So what is it that they're saying in this passage? It says, Jacob, why do you say, and Israel, why do you assert? And the word say and the word assert is in a tense that meant they just kept on saying. So what's being described here is this is a prevailing attitude among God's people. Jacob, why do you keep on saying? And Israel, why do you keep on asserting? My way is hidden from the Lord, and my claim is ignored by my God. What is it that they're saying? How are they feeling about this? They're basically saying what lots of suffering people say. Why haven't you done something about this? Have you forgotten me? And notice he calls them by their two names, Jacob and Israel. Those are the covenant names. It's Isaiah's way of saying he's made an agreement. He's made promises to you. And he is certainly not going to back out on those. Then he answers their question with a twofold answer. He gives them a theological answer and he gives them an experiential answer. Now the theological answer is found in verse 28 and 29. And what I'm going to do with the class is I'm just going to list the truths that is being stated in this, give a brief explanation, and then I'm going to ask the class, how do these things help these people who are suffering? How would they encourage them? How would it strengthen them? For example, he says, the Lord is the everlasting God. Everlasting God. He's the eternal God. That means he never changes. Hebrews said he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He never changes. He's dependable. It calls him the creator of the whole earth. He has all those attributes that are listed in verses 12 through 26. And you may want to take time to look through those. There is power and wisdom, authority, those kinds of things that are listed in verses 12 through 26. He possesses all those attributes. He's the origin of the universe. He maintains the universe. The universe is moving to accomplish his purposes. The universe will conclude and arrive at its destination that he has decided. He owns this place. He's the creator. It says next, he never becomes faint or weary. The idea is he's self-sufficient. He never has to abandon his purposes as unrealizable. He never has to postpone what he's doing in our work because he needs to rest. This is a self-sufficient God. There's nothing we will contribute to him. There's nothing he needs from us. He's self-sufficient. It says he's wise. He knows the right decisions. He has all that is necessary to lead us to make the right decisions and right choices. And then in verse 29, he goes on to say that not only is God like this, but the other thing you need to know is in verse 29, he gives strength to the faint and strengthens the powerless. That is, he is a God who shares his strength. And when he shares his strength, it is never diminished. He never suffers a lack when he gives it. This word powerless has about it the idea of the word bone. And it conveys the idea of dependability and stability. That is God's strength. It's dependable. It is stable. Now, after this discussion on the theological assertions, in verse 30 to 31, he turns to the experiential part of this relationship with God, this tireless source. He says, youths may become faint and weary, and young men stumble and fall. The words youth and young men are pushed towards the front of the sentence, which means they are to be emphasized. And the commentators say that the idea is it's choice young men. It's the best and the strongest of young men. It's the distinction of an Olympic athlete. His physical capabilities are supreme and above all others. He's in a category by himself. Or it can be used of soldiers, and they would have the strongest and healthiest of young men to be a soldier. And so the idea is, here is the best of human strength and ability. And if they fail, well then what possibility do the rest of us have? Well, he goes on to say in verse 31, but those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not become weary. They will walk and not faint. So what is the one condition in order to experience the strength of God? Well, he says it's trusting God. And this word trust has about it is a word that is also translated wait. And the word has about it complete dependence upon God. But it also carries with it a willingness to allow God to decide the terms. To wait on God is to say, we have no other help. We're helpless until God acts. This word wait, we've seen it earlier in Isaiah, it has this sense of confidence, expectation upon God. It's not that we don't do anything. We're doing what God told us to do and what God last spoke to us. But we release this frantic effort to save ourselves. We are trusting and waiting on God. And he says, when that happens, when a person depends upon God, he releases the time frame to God. But he's expecting God to come with that kind of expectant attitude. He said what happens is there's an exchange of strength that takes place. And he uses these examples like an eagle who spreads his wings and he simply rides the updraft of the wind. And so he's exchanging his strength for the strength of the wind. And he said, God will give you that kind of a strength to rise in victory. And then he talks about running, and he talks about walking. And it's the idea of steady progress forward. And that you'll do this with unlimited resources. And so do you see the idea? The idea is to convey that when you learn to trust God, when you depend upon Him, when you have this willingness to surrender the time frame to Him, but you have this expectation God is going to come in and He's going to deal with this. He's going to see that His ways and His purposes are accomplished. When that happens, there's an exchange of strength. And you rise on the strength of God, and progress is still made and moved forward. Renewal in the Christian life isn't dependent on you learning something new. Renewal in the Christian life is consistently based on these two things: reaffirming what you already know is true about God, and returning to do what God has called you to do. You see this in Revelation chapter 2, verse 5, the letter to the church at Ephesus. They've lost their first love. And John tells them what they need to do to change that and return to their first love. He says, remember the things you used to do. He says, remember, and then he says, repent, and then he says, do the things you first used to do. So this is what God calls us to do. We need to touch base with the good things that we know about God. We need to rehearse reality, and then we need to simply follow through in our life on those things. And what begins to happen is we begin to experience this exchange of strength and exchange of life. Now here's how I want to close the lesson. I'm going to point out the blank piece of paper on their chair, and I'm going to ask them to make a paper airplane. We may even have time to see who makes the best paper airplane, but I want them to make a paper airplane. Maybe some of them will need some help with that. And then I've asked them if they'll write down some notes on that paper airplane. This is the Airbus 380. It's the world's largest passenger airplane. And I'd like for them to write some statistics on that paper plane of theirs. For example, the world's largest airliner can carry over 800 passengers. The airline is 2/3 of a football field long. It's 238 feet long. It has 2 decks to it. The wingspan, in terms of the height, it's 79 feet tall, which is 10 stories. And the wingspan is 262 feet, which is twice the distance that the Wright brothers flew. It will hold 3,000 suitcases. I'd like for them to write that on their paper airplane. And then I want to say, comparing your paper airplane to that Airbus is no comparison at all. And Isaiah is saying, when you compare the living God, the sovereign creator, the one who is willing to give you this source of life and strength, when you compare him to anything else in this life that you would trust, it's as foolish as holding up that paper airplane and saying it's as equal to that 360 Airbus. Isaiah calls us to put our trust in God because there's nothing else that compares to the living God. God bless you. Thank you for teaching God's Word this Sunday.